Well, hello everybody, and a very warm welcome. I'm Catherine McGuinness, Policy Chair at the City of London Corporation, and I'm delighted that you've all been able to join us for this session. It's clearly unfortunate that MC12 has had to be cancelled, but I'm really pleased that we've been able to convene this virtual panel session nonetheless on whether all services will be environmental services in future. And we will be exploring that really important topic, the link between service trade and global environmental objectives. The City of London Corporation is one of the bodies which works to represent the UK-based financial and professional services sector, both at home and abroad. And one of our key roles is to drive forward some of the big policy challenges facing the services sector today. And greening the global economy is, quite simply, the greatest challenge of our time. The role of global services trade in contributing to international net zero objectives has to be a core consideration. And so it's a great pleasure for me to moderate today's session entitled Will All Services Be Environmental Services in the Future? And I'd very much like to thank the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, for making this happen. And I'm fortunate to be joined by four great panelists. I've got Ambassador Rebecca Fisher-Lamb, UK Deputy Permanent Representative to the WTO. I would have had Sally Jones, Head of Trade Strategy at EY, but she sends her apologies. She's unable to come because of the COVID situation. I've got George Riddell instead, Director of Trade Strategy at EY. And George, I'm delighted to have you on the panel. I have James Kenny, Head of Global Affairs and PR at Arup. And I have Ron Steenblick, Senior Fellow at the IISD. I'm going to turn to Rebecca, George, James and Ron for reflections in a moment. But before I do that, I'd just like to offer some thoughts about how we in the City of London Corporation are approaching the link between services trade and net zero. One route has been through convening the right voices, and a key vehicle for that is the UK Professional and Business Services Council. The PBSC convenes representatives from across professional and business services, and it advocates for PBS interests. And I mention this here because we know that the PBS sector is right at the forefront of environmental services provision worldwide and has driven so much of the change that we're going to be discussing today. Indeed, I co-chair the PBSC's International Trade Group, which addresses key PBS trade policy concerns and also carries forward work on trade promotion. And I think the question of trade in environmental services is one which can and should be approached both through a policy and through a promotional lens. Actually, I'd also note here that both George and James are active and highly valued PBSC members, and it's particularly good to have you there with that voice. So one role in the margins of COP26, which of course has just finished, the one role that we played in COP26 was actually, again, acting as a convening power. We held a Green Horizons Summit, GHS at COP26, drawing together the breadth of the financial and professional services sector. And it focused on the role that the private sector must play in support to ensure that net zero targets are met. We came away from Glasgow actually energised by the momentum that we saw there and with renewed ambition to explore these questions from all possible angles. We backed the convening role up with specialist research, and back in September, the City Corporation published a report with KPMG entitled Trade and Environmental Services, Barriers to Trade and Approaches to Liberalisation. When we started out on that work, our thinking was that although we know that services provide the glue which keeps the international trading system functioning, efforts at harnessing the power of trade in support of sustainability objectives have focused largely on trade in environmental goods. As such, we saw trade in environmental services, services which are in some way environmentally related, as being less well understood. Our paper looked at the current definitions of environmental services, the main impediments to the international trade of environmental services, and recent efforts at liberalisation. And one of our conclusions was that the current definitions of environmental services no longer reflect the nature of modern services provision. Technology has revolutionized trade since the 1990s, and the range of services available has expanded enormously. One such evolution, for example, has been in sustainable finance, a subject clearly close to my heart, but that's not yet captured in current definitions. I think this is really fruitful territory for us to explore today, and in our discussion, I would be very interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on the current definitions in environmental services. What are the consequences of relying on outdated definitions? How best should we capture and measure modern environmental services provision? And what's the potential value of updating existing terminology? Another key finding for us from the paper was that the most pressing barriers to trade in environmental services are common across all services provision. Examples including misaligned regulatory regimes, mobility issues, restrictions on data flows, and mutual recognition of professional qualifications. I think we'd all agree that liberalisation of services trade has the potential to deliver environmental benefits, but where best should we focus our efforts? And again, I really look forward to hearing panelists' reflections on how multilateral efforts might be combined with other liberalising initiatives, either at a bilateral or at a plurilateral level. And it would be particularly useful to hear thoughts on how the WTO can play a role going forward. And lastly, it would be great to hear thoughts on how business and policymakers should best collaborate on these agendas. We at the City of London Corporation aim to provide a bridge between public and private sectors, and a steer from our panelists on how best this could be achieved would be of real value. Once more, thanks very much for joining the session, and I'll now turn to our panelists for reflections on the issues surrounding environmental services trade and the question, will all services be environmental services in the future? And I'm going to turn first to you, if I may, Rebecca, for your remarks. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to join this very important panel discussion. So I'm Rebecca. I've just arrived in Geneva as the new UK Economic Ambassador and Deputy Perm Rep to the WTO. In my close to 10 years now working on trade, the majority of that time has been on services. So I was really excited to see this panel discussion coming together to talk about this really important topic. Unfortunately, as has been said, this isn't happening at the same time as the WTO ministerial MC12. And while we're really disappointed that MC12 couldn't go ahead with the rising number of cases, it does feel like cancelling was really the only option available to us. As you can imagine, a number of discussions are now going on to work out how we kind of regroup and where we go from this. So unfortunately, one of those is actually happening straight after this. I'm going to have to miss the last 15 minutes of this session and duck out early, which is really unfortunate because I think it's going to be such a great discussion. But my team is on the line and will be kind of noting everything that we're going through and all of the good ideas that I'm sure will come from this session today. And I'm really pleased that we're going ahead with the session today because it is such an important issue and it's an area where we really need to act and act quickly. And we're really pleased with the general direction of travel on this issue and the positive kind of outcomes that we're seeing from lots of different initiatives, particularly the COP26 commitments on coal and electric vehicles show that governments and businesses are committed to the green transition. However, progress and commitments for environmental services really do vary across region and vary across sectors. And that's why we're leading work on new environmental services initiatives at the WTO. We're aiming to bring together a broad coalition of members with interests in identifying and facilitating services that will be needed for that global transition to a green economy. And beyond this, we really want to go beyond this and look at the kind of definitions of environmental services to capture a much broader range of services and support that all support an environmental outcome. We're really actively engaging in the discussions here in Geneva, including through co-sponsoring an exploratory paper in the Council for Trade and Services special sessions. And this paper is really aiming to drive the debate multilaterally here in the WTO, and it's publicly available. So I'd really want to encourage everybody on this session to go and take a look. And off the back of that paper, we've used it to facilitate and encourage a number of discussions between a diverse range of members on how we can change our understanding of environmental services and what services can really do to contribute to the environment debate and to some positive outcomes in the WTO. And obviously, domestic legislation is going to be really crucial in the green transition. And in that sense, we really welcome the discussions and the conclusion of the domestic regulation, JSI, which will increase transparency for service suppliers. And I'm really pleased to say that that is going ahead. So although the ministerial has obviously been postponed, we are going ahead with the launch of the domestic regulation, JSI, and that is going to happen tomorrow, which we think is a really important thing, because obviously that will have direct impacts for businesses at the start of next year. So we really didn't want it to get delayed any further. This is quite a new policy challenge, was the other thing I really wanted to touch on. So it's going to be really crucial for us to all work together, both governments and businesses, to identify a response that will genuinely deliver environmental outcomes and facilitate trade. So we really want your input and thinking. And again, I think this will be a really good chance for us to start to discuss some of these challenges and really get a sense of your views and insights. And we've been looking at lots of different reports and papers, and I'm really excited. I've sort of had a break from services in the last 2 years, and it's been great to come back to this discussion and to actually see just how much research is out there on this topic, how much more focus is now put on what services can do to drive environmental outcomes. And we are going to be listening with interest, but I also wanted to flag that Lizzie Durham from our team and Eve, who's in my team based in Geneva here, and Lizzie's in our London team, are both listening into this session, taking notes, but we really want to encourage everyone to come and talk to us. We really want to hear your views and really want to keep having this discussion about what more we can do in the WTO and through our bilateral trade agreements in this space. So it's a really important issue for us. We're really pleased to be here having this discussion. I'm just sorry I can't stay for the whole of it, and looking forward to a really good discussion and debate. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. Brilliant. Can I hand over now to George? George, would you like to speak to us?
Thanks, Catherine. Really appreciate it. And great to be here today, even though, as everyone said, the ministerial itself isn't happening. I think one of the things to really focus on as part of this discussion is what's happening on the ground with business with regards to environmental services. And I think there's two aspects to this in terms of how service providers are reacting to this new reality. The first is that really, in order to produce an environmental product or to make a company more sustainable, they need services at nearly every stage of the business process. So as Catherine mentioned, from the financing and green finance through to the architectural and engineering aspects of a particular project or production process, through to the auditors, as boring as they are important with the accountants, to make sure that companies are actually measuring and living up to the commitments that they themselves have made, and that there's a way of collecting that data and benchmarking against industry best practice. So it's really throughout an entire life cycle of a business, those services that are embedded into any particular product or type of business needs to become more and more sustainable over the course of the coming years, if indeed we are to meet our net zero aims and keep global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's that really practical aspect of how businesses are reacting and what's needed. I think the second component, and I've certainly seen this in my own firm in EY, before what you had was a sustainability team that was sat off to the side, that they were off doing their own thing. It was a discrete service in and of itself, and that team provided some things around sustainable insurance and various other types of services. Although what we've seen over the course of particularly the last 3 years is that their work is now mainstreamed across everything we do. So there's no major project that we'll undertake that doesn't have some form of sustainability embedded within it. So it's really changing how our tax team, our consulting team, our assurance team are approaching the ways that they provide professional services today. And I think that's a really interesting development and speaks to the title of the session, because you do have discrete environmental services that are very much focused on particular aspects of sustainability, but also increasingly what's happening is those sustainable aspects are getting mainstream across traditional services that are being provided by a huge range of professional business technology providers. And I think that's a really exciting definition, exciting development. One of the main things that, obviously has been that we'll tackle here is that a lot of the liberalization measures that we experience, that would apply to environmental services, apply to wider services provision as well. And I think that challenge is one that not only the WTO but countries around the world have been trying to grapple with. But I think for us, particularly as service providers, what we want to see, and the main things that we're thinking about tackling, is how do you scale? So how can you make sure that this is being replicated around the world, and how quickly can you do it? Because they're really the two aspects that we need to make sure is achieved in order to expand the use and provision of environmental services around the world to achieve those public policy aims that I was speaking about before. So just some ideas there, Catherine. Thank you, and back to you. You're muted, Catherine. Sorry.
Brilliant. Someone had to do it. I'm sorry about that. Ron, can I hand over to you perhaps for the APEC perspective and a wider trade and environmental view, perhaps?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I suppose I come with a little bit of a jaded view, because I've been observing efforts to try to liberalize trade and environmental services for the past 20 years. It already had started in the services negotiations, the WTO, in 2000, and it was encouraged in the Doha Round Declaration in 2001. And we've certainly seen some progress in services trade liberalization in bilateral trade agreements, but at the broader regional and multilateral scale, there's a lot that still remains to be done. Now, I'm very encouraged by what's been happening in APEC, so I was worked together with Hildegard Nordis on a paper for APEC during this year, hosted by New Zealand, which one of the things that we were asked to do was to review existing definitions of environmental services, and also come up with basically a list. And that list was largely adopted as a reference list on environmentally related services by APEC recently, and I sent a link to that. I think what's been very useful is they've included a fairly succinct definition of environmental services for that, which are those that directly relate to environmental conditions, and directly contribute to the design, construction, and operation of facilities or equipment determined to improve environmental conditions. But on associated services like professional services, the list includes them only when they require specific training or knowledge regarding the environmental impact of such facilities. Now, that's not to say that I disagree with the premise of this, is that almost all services will probably have some environmental content, but of course, most of this work is being conducted in the context of some kind of liberalization effort, so one has to narrow it down. But the list the reference list is much larger than the previous what's called the W120 list that basically the WTO has been working from, and which focuses almost exclusively on environmental services that are really purely environmental, like waste collection and sewage treatment and that like. expanding the definition to include a lot of services that are not exclusively environmental has raised the specter in some people's minds of what they call dual use services. And this really worries me that people are expressing concern about this, because if the idea is, well, a particular service could be used for something like oil drilling, you know, there's getting the feeling that there are some national delegations who will say, oh, well, then we don't want to include it. And you know, I think that really shows a misunderstanding of how these are used. I mean, if a country is bound and determined to develop its oil and gas services, oil and gas industry, it's going to, you know, make sure that that it has access to foreign expertise on things like geophysical services, you know, having trade barriers to trade in those is unlikely to be the way that they're going to go about prohibiting the development of new oil and gas fields if that's what they want to do. On the other hand, there could be countries where, for example, they're not oil and gas producers, and they have you know, think that they have some geothermal potential where they very much would need those kinds of services, but for some reason there exist barriers to trade in that really inadvertent, and it would facilitate the development of those resources and reduce their costs by reducing barriers to trade in those. So I think this is a, you know, topic that merits a lot more discussion, but this dual, you know, I mean, basically the short of it is that this dual use issue is, I think, a non-issue and potentially harmful. I mean, it's not really much to what I can add to what the previous speakers have said. That, you know, just to reiterate that the close synergy between trade in environmental goods and trade in environmental services, you know, that I'm glad to see it coming back, but you know, surely let's learn from the some of the mistakes in past negotiations, particularly at the multilateral level, and be willing to make some bold moves this time around. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ron. And just to draw you in a slightly extra direction as well, you've written quite a lot about the impact of technology in changing services provision. Do you have any comments on how we should be thinking about that before I move on to James?
Well, I mean, the clear example is Mode 1 services that at the time that the W120 was drawn up, nobody was thinking of Mode 1 very much, particularly in these kinds of things, and that's the ability to, particularly to monitor facilities, has vastly expanded the scope of the type of environmental services that can now be provided. And so, I mean, you have the famous cases of companies in one country monitoring and even controlling wind turbine parks or biogas digesters, and you know, sending alerts to the farmers that they need to intervene. And in the case of the biogas one, you have also, I mean, just for example, the advent of drones has enabled some service providers to attach very lightweight monitoring instruments and actually fly into the plumes of let's say, power plant or factory point sources of emission, and get real data and transmit that those data back to some kind of a analyst. I mean, one of the ones that I think is also often overlooked and is a really interesting one is related to this last one about monitoring. That when you have monitoring instruments, you do have to calibrate them from time to time. You have to certify that they're actually measuring correctly, and there are now services that specialize just in that. Just in you send us your equipment and we'll test it, calibrate it, certify that it's measuring correctly, and then send it back. So there's the only limit to services is people's imagination.
Great, thank you very much. And James, getting back to the business perspective, speaking from your view with Arup as an engineering firm, what are your thoughts?
So, I mean, well, I think the first thing to say, even if anyone in this organisation, this group, has any influence, was to really make a special pleadings for environmental services to be at the top of the kind of trade agenda. Having just been through COP and looked at some of those potentially disastrous scenarios we're facing, I think this is a case that really kind of merits that kind of special attention. And I hope that the work of Ron and others will be supported, despite the kind of the politics and a lot of the very, very technical kind of challenges that we face. So having moved on from the public service announcement, what do we see as the kind of the barriers as a practitioner and the challenges and of course the opportunities? Well, I mean, first of all, the first thing we'd say is that, services do not fit into any kind of neat little boxes where you can look up a schedule and say 8406970 turbine blade. These are complex systems of systems, networks of networks, and that's how we understand whether we're treating the symptom of a problem or the cause of a particular problem, whether that's traffic congestion or flooding. And of course, through that system of thinking, we can really understand where to target investment and make the most meaningful difference to people's lives. So if I'm thinking, like, for example, of this project we did in India a while back, it's like we're looking at the proximate challenge was flooding in the rainy season, but then we're using GIS modeling, systems thinking, creative design engineers, hydrologists working with local communities. And of course, the solution we developed did tackle the flooding, but also looked at resilience for managing the water for the farmers. We delivered a significant health benefit on malaria levels by looking at reducing the breeding grounds for mosquitoes. That's fairly typical even for a relatively simple project. And of course, if you want to maximize the benefit of these kind of interventions, you're looking at multiple consultancy services, digital mapping, hydrology, engineering design, health management, stakeholder engagement, economics planning, project and cost management, to name but a few. And that's before you start getting into the more sophisticated things that we were going to need at massive scale. Say, for example, managing a just transition, switching a large city from reliance on coal-fired power into, distributed renewable energy networks. You can quickly see where one of those issues with dual use comes up, but we have to get on with that. We have to make it work. We're looking at digital twins, we're looking at monitoring and measurement, economics, and all these kind of interventions long before we actually work out how to prioritize, tackle problems, how we might plan and finance each scheme, whether it's skills training, active transport, or financing with green bonds. But given that we're waking up to this challenge, I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic that environmental services will be the kind of the future, as the topic of this session suggests. But of course, we appreciate there's lots and lots of challenges here, especially when you're talking about the teams that are going to be delivering these projects are scattered all over the globe. And you're obviously dealing with both mode and scope of service in many cases. So it's going to be a big issue. I mean, the OECD report we looked at recently was $6.9 trillion per year up to 2030 is going to be needed on environmental services. So this is going to be a lot of pain points we have to go through. And of course, those projects, that money needs a really broad range of professional business services to deliver it. If we're actually going to make it happen, that's from financiers, accountants, insurers, asset management, economists, development advisors, architects, engineers, and all the rest. because these environmental projects are simply not bankable or deliverable without that broad group. So I think what we're seeing is that, you know, COP's thrown up a lot of scary scenarios, but it's also demonstrated that people are willing to actually look at the challenge here. And of course, this is an investment in the very future of the planet, you know, with a payback that is positive net present value. So I think we really have to be looking at this as a win-win and not as a kind of a trading kind of platform. So back to the basics, you know, rights of establishment, mobility, professional qualifications, tax treatments, you know, all the rest. You know, we really have to make this work if we want to make a difference on the big challenge facing us all today. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, James. And just one quick follow-up for you. You said that we're waking up to the challenge. I just wanted to ask you how far you thought that firms, well, from your experience, I mean, how far are Arup's clients and shareholders pushing the firm in an environmental direction, and how far are you setting the agenda yourselves?
Well, I mean, we've had a long-standing kind of commitment to try and push our clients to do a bit more. But I think we're seeing kind of global trends are doing a lot of the heavy lifting as well. You know, we've got the new TCFD rules on reporting disclosure, lots of asset managers, banks, insurers worried about stranded assets. We've got the new EU taxonomy, a very lively discussion about carbon border adjustment mechanism and global carbon pricing. You know, these are really big issues that are going to start becoming embedded in all of these discussions, and that's before we get to green bonds and the green finance elements. As I say, I'm kind of hoping that, you know, in the near future we'll be in a world where we don't talk about green buildings or green infrastructure. We just talk about buildings and infrastructure because we've raised the regulatory kind of standards enough to make this a more meaningful kind of delivery schedule. But you know, as I say, trying to be optimistic. Sorry, Ron, it's like we got to really get into this one, I think.
Great, thank you very much. And there's a good question come through already in the chat, and I'll come on to that in a second. And can I just ask people who'd like to ask questions to put it into the chat? But the first thing I'd actually like to ask, and perhaps I'd turn back to you, Rebecca, and then to George. You know, we've been talking about environmental services here, but what actually are environmental services anyway? And what are the implications of narrow definitions? Rebecca, perhaps I could come to you first and then George.
Great, just checking I'm off mute. Yes, I am. Brilliant, thank you. So environmental services in the kind of trade bubble, as it were, usually refers to things like sewage disposal, refuse disposal, sanitation services. And I personally remember during the TTIP negotiations when we were an EU member state, we got very excited in the UK government because we realised we could probably open up our waste disposal market and take commitments on waste, because the UK had recently privatised that service, and we were looking at how could we take commitments and then use that to drive up other EU member states to take commitments. I remember at the time having a really good discussion around, oh, this is going to be great for our environmental credentials. It's a really positive step in the right direction. And I was sort of sat there going, kinda, but like actually, yes, maybe if the private sector drives a more of a focus on recycling through this process, then yes, that would be great. But beyond that, it feels a little bit limited and a little bit shallow. And one of the things that we realised when we were starting to try and do is to push the EU to take a much more broad, much more kind of open focus to what environmental services could look like and how they can contribute to the kind of environment and climate debate. And now, obviously, we have a little bit more space to develop our own UK policy on how we want to approach this one. And we have been taking a much more holistic approach to what we count as environmental services. So looking beyond those traditional core environmental services, how a whole range of different sectors can positively contribute, from engineering services, architect services, construction, consulting. And I just wanted to pause a little bit here on my time in Africa. So I've just come from being the Deputy Trade Commissioner for Africa based in Nairobi. And we had Alok Sharma, who was the Secretary of State in charge of obviously COP, come out to Nairobi on a visit. And one of my favourite parts of that visit, I don't know if anyone has been to Nairobi on this call, you will know that traffic is a complete nightmare. A 10-minute journey can take well over an hour if you hit it at the wrong time. So you have lots of motorbikes on the road, nipping through the traffic and driving on the pavements to try and get people somewhere. And it's horrendous. It's so polluting. You walk into the street and it's just sort of smog of fumes everywhere. So we were working with a British company who was designing electric motorbikes. So we got Alex Sharma on the Secretary of State on an electric motorbike, which was quite a lot of good fun. And he kept talking about it as a good and as a product. And we were actually talking about the services that were behind that bike that enabled that to happen, enabled it to come to Kenya, the design, the support behind it. And one of the other things we always heard across the whole of Africa was a real focus on UK companies and wanting UK companies particularly involved in big infrastructure projects. And a big part of that kind of demand was really around the quality, but also the sustainable approach that UK businesses bring. So they wanted our professional services companies involved in big, major projects, including some of the China Belt and Road Initiative stuff that is obviously happening in Africa, including big projects funded by government, funded by construction companies and others, around actually how can we bring professional services from the UK to meet the same standards as in the UK, and that real kind of environmental focus that our services sector brings. And so actually we are really keen to think about how you're seeing business drive this, you're seeing businesses behave in a much more sustainable manner. And it's really exciting that the UK companies are at the forefront of that and providing that offer to governments around the world. And we have to match that in our trade agreements and actually start to really think about what commitments can we take that reflect the modern global economy and what we're really seeing service providers offer to try and tackle this challenge, and how can we make sure that trade policy keeps up with that and matches it. So very, very interested in ideas on how we do that. Thanks.
Thank you. And actually, if I could just ask a quick follow-up, does the fact that the definitions are narrow at the moment impact on the government's capacity to speak about that great services offer that you've just outlined? Does it limit our capacity to speak about that overseas?
Yes and no. So I would say it has historically. So I think obviously, as I was kind of just describing, the example of me sat in the European Commission trying to work out whether or not we could liberalise our waste service actually took hours and hours of my life. And it was a really important debate, but it definitely didn't feel like it was going to be the solution or the key offer that services could bring. And I think actually the more that we can have this conversation, I think others have mentioned sort of dual use and the debate around the categories, and actually from a UK perspective, we're really interested in just seeing how, I think the City of London Corporation described it as a spectrum of actually kind of different uses and different ways in which service providers offer these things. And I do think we need to look at it. So it does definitely, the debate around actually what are these companies doing and how does that contribute to the environment, and what are the right commitments for then governments to be taking in this area. We do have to look at that very carefully, but actually the fact that we're having this debate, that there's lots of evidence out there, that we are talking, as I said before, we're talking quite a lot here in the WTO about what sort of commitments can those look like and how can we take them, is so much further forward than when I left this debate sort of 2.5 years ago when I went out to Africa. So actually we are seeing I'm much more optimistic. We're seeing a much more intense discussion now about how we do this. Not to say that it's easy or straightforward, but actually that just means that it's even more important for us to really put some focus and energy into answering that question. And the UK is very keen to be a leading voice in this discussion.
Great, thank you very much. And George, can I hand over to you?
Thanks, Catherine. I really agree with what Rebecca's just said. And I think one of the dangers of that narrow definition, particularly when we look at the context in which it was constructed with the provisional CPC codes and sort of being agreed as part of the General Agreement on Trade and Services and the WTO in 1994, is that our understanding back then of environmental services was more limited than today, and sort of in terms of the scope and types of activities that service providers are undertaking in order to provide environmental services that tackle also different parts of the sustainability agenda as well. So we've got waste, water, recycling, carbon, there's a lot of different aspects that have evolved over since 1994 that we're really trying to address now, and at different stages in sort of the business life cycle, whether it's initiating a project, as James was talking about, with engineers and architects, all the way through to sort of that full end of life part of a business cycle as well, whether we're talking about reuse of materials or, you know, monitoring and repair and all of those types of things that come with that full aspect of environmental services. One of the really interesting things around sort of trade liberalization with regards to services is, how do you create that enabling environment? If we not so much dealt with in the WTO yet until the domestic regulation talks come in, but, you know, mutual recognition of professional qualifications. So what the WTO is doing is creating a enabling framework for countries to talk to each other in order to provide increased transparency and consistency around professional qualifications and how that's recognized between jurisdictions. That's not to say that the professional qualifications themselves won't change, which, you know, particularly in the context of environmental services, we know that much more is being done in the accountancy profession, much more is being done in the engineering profession as people and professionals gain their qualifications. The skills that they're learning through that sort of learning journey is changing over time, and I think is only going to accelerate. But what the WTO can do is not say, well, you know, in order to hold a professional qualification, it needs X% content of environment to be contained within it. What it's doing is setting out that enabling environment so that as these professions develop and the qualifications develop, the enabling environment lets them provide those services across international borders.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions. One of the issues that we were focusing on at COP was the importance of coherence across borders, the importance of having a global playbook, as it were, you know, consistency and at least baseline of regulations and requirements, or you know, reporting and measurement. And I think this maybe ties in with the question that we've got. Making all services environmental is indeed germane for a safe planet. Can that be done without enabling regulatory law? That's one part of the question. And I think there's another question. To what extent has autonomous liberalisation by countries led to meaningful market access? And how does autonomous liberalisation compare to bound commitments at the WTO and bilateral and regional trade agreements? Has anyone tried to measure this? So I suppose I'm combining those two, and please don't feel the need to answer it in a combined way if it doesn't make sense. But my question is, to what extent should we be looking at a sort of global multilateral set of, plurilateral set of plurilateral approach, and to what extent should we be looking bilaterally? And yeah, any thoughts on that, or either question? And so Rebecca, do you want to come in on that?
Shall I jump in first, and then really interested in others? And actually just gives me a brilliant chance to highlight all the good work that is happening here. So I would say first, as somebody that is kind of watching this ministerial getting postponed and redone, that I do not underestimate the challenge of trying to get this stuff done multilaterally. And at the moment, our big challenge of trying to actually have a ministerial. That said, the whole reason why it's so important to have these discussions multilaterally is because you need I completely agree with whoever's comment it was about needing every country to recognise this. It is a global challenge. It cuts across lots of different borders. Actually, service suppliers as well operate across the globe, and we need to give them the right support and regulatory kind of setup to do that. I'm a big believer in autonomous liberalisation by countries driving progress in trade agreements. So my example of our waste system was an autonomous liberalisation by the UK that we were then able to lock into our trade agreements. But by doing that, we were then able to say to every other EU member state and to others in our trade negotiations, look, we've done this. Actually, we're still able to pick up people's bins. It's really important to do, and to push others to take those sorts of commitments. And I've seen it again and again in Africa when you're able to say, look, this is how a more liberal system has worked and worked successfully. And if you're able to make that liberalisation, we can support you to do that. And then we can take commitments in our FTAs to ensure that future governments don't backslide from that. So I think it is a really important signalling and driving force that then gets fed into trade agreements. Just to talk for a minute about what's actually going on in the WTO, because we've talked about what can the WTO do. And one of the things that's really exciting is we're trying to do some stuff. So first of all, on the kind of multilateral level, as I said, we are driving discussions in the Council for Trade and Services. So particularly here, what we've been trying to do is put forward a paper that has a number of proposals on what we can look at. And we've used this paper to kind of really spark discussions and debates. So we've been putting it on the agenda for the services special session and actually kind of having wider discussions as a whole group. And then we're also trying to talk a lot to other members individually about what does this look like in lean, and that is very much reflecting what we're doing in our bilateral trade agreements as well. So we're raising this issue in every single forum that the UK is in a negotiation on, and we're raising it in a consistent way, pushing for the same sort of issues. And then the other thing, just to make sure everyone in this group has spotted, is the TESD initiative. So TESD's ministerial was meant to happen this week. It was meant to be a discussion on progress. I have to say it's another thing that we're slightly sad isn't going ahead, obviously because, to be honest, it was just sort of taking stock of progress. And actually we are saying to all the members in that group, we need to keep these discussions going. So though it's been postponed, we actually are hoping that there will be a kind of continued initiative and continued push. And within this initiative, because it's broader than just services, we are really raising the services issue and trying to make sure that there are really clear commitments on sort of how we can take the services discussion forward. So the UK is trying to make sure that we're driving some of this stuff and actually kind of picking up on really clear initiatives that can be done at the multilateral level, and then making sure that it is a point of discussion in all of our bilateral agreements. So hopefully that's a bit of context on where we're coming at it from and what we're hoping the WTO might be able to do. Thanks.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much, Rebecca. George, did you want to comment on that at all?
Thanks, Catherine. I'd also be really interested in hearing what Ron thinks of this question too. But I think with regards to regulation, there is always this challenge of, do you want to be prescriptive or prescriptive? And in particular, when it comes to environmental services, you know, I'm a big fan of sort of defining what sort of the objective we want to reach is, and making sure that the right incentives and also penalties are placed on companies seeking to as they move towards those objectives. But as we've discussed, there's lots of different ways of potentially getting there, and you don't want to be too sort of defined in how you approach that regulation, because it can in some ways stifle that innovation that the companies need in order to make the transition to a more sustainable business model. You've also got this question of that you yourself raised, Catherine, of how does regulation work across borders and between different jurisdictions, and that's where I think increasingly more discussion is needed by and between governments, but also bringing in the regulators as well. You know, the financial services sector and financial services industry is very good at that regulator to regulator discussions and making sure that, you know, there is interoperability between different financial systems around the world, and what that means for different financial service providers as a regulated industry. And it's very important that those discussions happen. I think other industries are behind the financial services industry, where, you know, increasingly we are seeing a lot of domestic regulation in the environmental space, but much less regulated discussion around it. And I think in the future, we're going to need to have much more of that. Otherwise, there will be unintended trade barriers as service providers of all kinds try and provide and trade across borders.
Great, thank you very much. James, was there anything you wanted to add? I'm then going to turn to Ron on that and another question.
Just a super quick couple of points there. I mean, looking at the kind of risk of greenwashing, I think it's actually really important that there's a high degree of kind of liberalisation of services, just to ensure that we don't go down that path. And that will be driven by a lot of commercial interests. And I think when, you know, if you want to try and really open up the market, because there is a lot of money looking for the opportunities in the space. And I think, you know, any country that is keeping those kind of barriers up is going to be missing out on quite a lot of investment opportunity to come in to actually make that transition. And of course, for firms like us, I mean, and I think really for many professional business services firms, I mean, you know, in practical terms, we tend not to really want to be flying people in and flying people out. We tend to want to build local services to be effective and high quality wherever we work. So again, it's that kind of win-win narrative I think we have to be sharing to actually break down some of these barriers that you see.
Great, thank you very much. And Ron, I wonder if I can bring you in, and also while speaking, if you want to address one of the other questions in the chat from Hannah's.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, my partner Hildegard Nordas is much better on talking about the actual regulatory side of services. But let me I'll make one point on that also. I mean, lately I've been involved in some of the discussions about international standards on regulations and the diversions from that. And one of the interesting questions to me was whether when people are talking about barriers, they're talking about they have in mind standards related to the performance of the service itself, as opposed to standards related to essentially the product of the service. So, for example, if you're a service provider engaged to retrofit and with the aim of improving the energy efficiency of a building, and there are some international standards related to building energy efficiency and so forth. If you're working in a country that has different standards from that, from those international standards, is that a barrier? To me, it's a really different level of barrier, if a barrier at all, than those which are actually applied directly to the service. I mean, that maybe is a bit of an arcane detail here, but if anybody has any opinion on that, I'd be interested in that. And then just, I don't know if you're allowing some of the participants to come in and actually ask questions, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce this, but Hannes Schulman, I think made a very good point, and has about basically, I think responding positively to the general sense that I was given before about trying to figure out how to make this all work better. I mean, and that basically the categories and the definitions are, as Hannes writes, are there to serve people, not vice versa. So on that, again, coming back to the definitions, I think probably if I mean, this is maybe a little bit radical, but rather than some kind of international agreement that it enforces everybody to be liberalizing trade in all of the areas, that I do like the APEC approach, where it's a bit more voluntary, and where they saying, look, these are the ones we really want you to think about, and then, you know, to try to concentrate the regulators' minds to look at to what extent they have regulations or other barriers that are inhibiting trade in those, and that the question of actual formal commitments is the next step after that. But at least let's get countries thinking about, do we really need these particular regulations, or you know, can we do something to make it easier for people to trade? Just on the mode one, responding to James, I mean, I think that he's absolutely right, that what we see is you know, a lot of mode 3, but of course, you know, if you're in an area, let's say Africa or Southeast Asia or whatever, you might have have some kind of local offices in one country, let's say Vietnam, and then you're not going to set up a separate office in Cambodia or Laos. So you still are going to be in the region, but but strictly speaking, you're crossing a border there. So, just that the mode 4 problems aren't, are not going to necessarily disappear unless you're planning to have offices in every single country, or sorry to use the APEC term, economy.
Great, thank you very much. And I know Rebecca has to leave, so I'm going to turn to Rebecca very quickly. First of all, ask you how the public and private sector could work together more closely on this agenda. But secondly, just if you have any other final thoughts you'd like to pass on before you leave.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I have to say, I'm really sad to be going, genuinely, because I think this is a really good discussion and a really good debate, and a bit of a kind of open offer to everyone to say we really want to keep this conversation going. We are really interested in ideas about how. I think a lot of what's been great from all of our panelists is actually a recognition that this is so important. This issue matters. We should be doing more in the trade space. We should be doing more multilaterally, and we're really interested in how we can be that leading voice here in Geneva. So I spent the last 2 years, as I said, out in Africa, and when I was there, we used to talk to businesses all the time, and we used to say, tell us your barriers, and then we'll see if we can do something in the trade space to fix it. And then businesses would look at us and go, well, you need to be more specific. What do you want to know? And where do you want to know? And from which sector and which country? And we would kind of go around in this beautiful circle of looking at each other. And I managed to realize that what actually helps us the most in this conversation between government and business is being as specific as possible. So please tell us which markets you're working in and where this matters to you, which sectors and areas are you interested in taking forward. And then the other thing that I found works really well is to have kind of proper discussion. So not a kind of one-off question, send us some emails with some bullet points in, but actually kind of get around the table and have a debate out about, right, which sectors should we prioritize this in? Which option should we go for? Is it about modes of supply? Is it about rules? Is it about trying to push better domestic regulation? Where's the different levers that are available to us, and actually getting the people that kind of know the ins and outs of the WTO and what might be possible together with businesses and having a proper conversation that says, right, we would love to be able to say that we can fix it all and do it all, but having worked in the WTO before, I know that this is going to take a while, and actually we need to be as creative as we possibly can be. So getting around a table and having a proper chat to enable that creativity, we're very keen to do. So as I said, both Lizzie and Eve from my team remain on the line, and would love to have lots of people following them up to this session full of ideas that they can take forward, and really happy to have that discussion. So thank you very much for having me, and really hoping this is the start of a more detailed conversation on this. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Rebecca, and I hope everybody has heard that invitation and will be following up with you. I must say there is some fantastic questions coming up in chat. I won't open the mic to people because I think we've only got 15 minutes left, and it's probably easier to have the questions in the chat and then relay them. But I'd really like to explore this one from Sebastian now. How do we deal with services that may be considered environmental in some jurisdictions and awful in others? And the example being waste collection by means of landfill, for instance. The question suggests, queries whether finance or academia has got to any useful definition. I think it's a very challenging question. I wonder if anybody has any thoughts. James, you're smiling. Do you want to come in on that one?
Well, I mean, this is kind of quite an interesting area in terms of global trade and services. I mean, you know, some of the work we're doing in India, for example, is looking at very, very old kind of landfills and actually looking at remediation projects, looking at kind of how we kind of extract methane from the kind of waste, you know, in other countries. You know, there's a lot of kind of potential with each of these, but of course, setting up the actual waste collection systems themselves is an environmental service that is, I think, already covered under GATS, and you know, people can do that. But of course, when you get into it, when you get into the reality of it, what you're really talking about is a lot of, you know, city regulations, local politics, you know, trying to encourage people to kind of take this as a serious kind of issue, then get the funding and the kind of the processes to set up the governance. So you're talking about a lot of legal and regulatory work long before you actually get to dealing with the engineering part. Which again, you know, there's no such thing as an awful environmental service. It's about the standards that you kind of try and impose and the governance you should set up, you know, once you're actually in the kind of in the middle of looking at the challenge. in front of you, you know. So I think, you know, what we've got is lots and lots of opportunity there. And what we need is kind of a degree of cooperation and collaboration in trying to establish how we're going to tackle them. But there's no, I mean, engineers, you know, they give us a problem, we will fix it. You know, we might not tell you what the bill is straight away, you know, but it's not always going to be affordable. But certainly the regulatory frame is really kind of absolutely critical, and the political will to making these things deliverable.
Ron, any thoughts from you on this one?
I apologize, I wasn't listening so closely because I was answering one of the questions in the chat. So
great. It was really the question about something that is environmentally, you know, positive, viewed as positive in one area and is really negative in another area. And actually, I suppose it ties into another question from Yvonne about how countries can be assisted to model best practices and to overcome cultural differences when they're faced with limited budgets. That's an interesting one. Really, this interesting question of how things are viewed differently in different places. And any thoughts?
Separately, it's I'd have to reflect further on the cultural differences part, because I mean, I'm certain that there that those exist, and you know, a good consultancy would be aware of those before they try to enter a particular market. It's not exactly services, but I mean, just a very concrete example on the side of goods is that you have, as I understand it anyway, in Japan, clothes are washed in cold water. In the United States and Europe, they're washed in hot water, but in the United States, or North America anyway, the water comes directly from the hot water heater, whereas in Europe, it's the appliance that heats it itself. I mean, that's just a small example. It's not, strictly speaking, it's more technological, I suppose, than cultural, but I mean, it also reflects just the way that people are used to how they wash their clothes. In terms of best practices, that's a good point. I mean, one of the things that one of the really interesting web pages that I discovered in this work for APEC, and we actually put it in the report to encourage it, was that UNIDO, so United Nations Industrial Development Organization, I believe, has a really good website. One part of it is in English in Japan, and you can go there, and it has all kinds of examples of projects of environmental goods and services, and where particular their companies have gone and exported their goods or services to other countries. And I mean, that's one starting point. I'm not sure it completely answers the question of overcoming cultural differences, but what we said was that it would be really helpful to some organization to set up and expand upon this list, so people can have a better idea and appreciation of just the innovation in goods and services that's being applied to address environmental problems.
Great, thank you. And George, did you want to come in all here?
Thanks. Yeah, a couple of reflections on this question of sort of in different types of services that can be viewed in different ways. And I'd say this is a problem across all services, really, and sort of this is why services is sometimes difficult to talk about, because you can have a very sustainable consulting project. You also have instances where in the past where consulting projects were not sustainable in any way, shape, or form, and were probably environmentally damaging. Equally, we've had the same in engineering, same in accounting, same in advertising as well, in terms of, and it's really about the trust available between the provider and the client, which is why we have sort of good regulatory practice, we have professional standards, and we have different types of regulation and reporting requirements placed on us as regulated service providers, because there is that asymmetry of information and trust when providing a service. And I think just recognizing that across the different services industries means that, you know, it's not just restricted to environmental services. On waste collection specifically, I think one of the things that we're moving to increasingly is this idea of a circular economy. So having less waste, better regulation around waste, better product standards as well, to make sure that they're more, you know, more able to be repaired and recycled going forward. So hopefully it is an issue that becomes less pressing over time.
Thanks very much. I wonder, George, do you have any thoughts on how the service sector could develop a better narrative about its value and role?
Thanks. I definitely think it's something that we need to do collectively a better job on. And there's two parts to that. One is really explaining that there's no such thing as just a product or a good anymore. Increasingly, the way that we've traditionally thought about trade, particularly in the WTO, is you've got goods on one side and services on the other. And today in the modern economy, those two are, absolutely entwined within one another, whether it's the Internet of Things, whether it's the monitoring and evaluation with drones that Ron was talking about earlier. That it is the idea that goods and services are distinct entities is completely false. And I think we need to do a better job of making sure that we talk about them in a more coherent way. In terms of sort of at the WTO and in the multilateral space, I think the TESDI initiative is doing a great job at pulling a lot of information, whether it's at the OECD, UNIDO, UN, obscure WTO databases as well, into one place and actually presenting it to policymakers and to businesses in a more coherent way. And anything we can do to support that and make sure that that information is not, obviously we need new information and better data and all the rest of it, but there's also a lot out there, and making sure that it's in one place and readily accessible is an important thing as well.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I'm very conscious that we could carry on for some time. We've only got about 5 or 6 minutes left. So I was going to ask each of you if you have any final reflections, or if there's anything that you've heard that you want to comment on, or indeed that you haven't heard that you'd like to have said. Who would I start with? James, would you like to come in first?
Thanks, Catherine. Well, first of all, just to say what a fascinating conversation it's been so far, and some great questions. I mean, looking at the challenge ahead of us, I'd reiterate that kind of point about this being a kind of a special pleading for environmental services to really get their act together and push this, because, even if you think about even advanced kind of countries like the US, if you want to be a registered engineer in one state, you might not necessarily be you wouldn't be a registered engineer in the state across next the neighbouring area. So that is not something that affects kind of developing or advanced nations. It really is a global problem that we have to really get our heads around. And then the other point is looking at that cultural point that was mentioned in the chat there from Yvonne. I mean, certainly, I would say that any project or big infrastructure like we do, we know that it affects kind of like thousands and usually millions of people. And any kind of approach that doesn't kind of recognize and respect those kind of cultural approaches is going to miss out on a lot of opportunity to actually be really effective. So I would just add that as a kind of a point coming back to that question there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I should have added, any vital next steps that you think we should be taking?
Well, I mean, looking out from my point of view as a practitioner, I'd say, WTO, bilateral, plurilateral, we don't care. I think the challenge is to get the conversation going and take our wins where we can, and then try and kind of push them up to becoming a global standard as and where. So tackle this on all fronts would be my challenge there.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with my text. Ron, what about you?
Sorry, I was putting my hand up because you're muted.
Yeah.
Well, no, sure. I'm going to drop a little bit of a bomb here, though. And one thing that really hasn't come up is that a lot of these core environmental services, they're basically carried out by government entities, municipal entities, particularly, and I just think that it's become almost like a taboo to really talk about that. I mean, there were some cases of poorly regulated, water monopolies and so forth, and so it's a lot of people, it's just like, oh my God, we can't even talk about that. I think that's really not helpful, and that there is the question of definitely you need to be prepared to regulate well if you're going to have private providers providing some of these services. But I mean, they're the companies that have the innovation and the technologies, the knowledge, and so forth. And I just think there needs to be more open to this on this, and then as Yvonne spoke also about best practice and how do you actually regulate these service providers when I'm talking about service providers that are actually, they don't come in and then go back out, but are actually established in treating water or treating waste or whatever, there needs to be a lot of discussion on best practice in that regulating of that kind of activity.
Right, thank you very much. And George, any final comments from you?
Thanks. Just to say, really agree with the other speakers, and to highlight the point, we really can't afford to be purists when it comes to scaling the use of environmental services around the world, whether it's multilateral, plurilateral, or bilateral. Indeed, arguably unilateral is probably the fastest and best course of action in many cases for some countries. That said, we do need to keep an eye on some of these measures. Governments in the past have tended to sometimes use environment as an excuse to become overly protective of their domestic market and use it to try and achieve other public policy goals. So in relation to Hannah's earlier question, if it's genuinely pro-environment, then I'd agree. Unfortunately, that's not always the case with some governments, and something we just need to be aware of when talking about trade and environmental services, is to make sure that some of the barriers to trade aren't unduly discriminative in terms of how they're operated. But just to say, this is definitely going to be a topic that we continue to have and talk about next year, and hopefully see some concrete action on from the business sector, but also WTO members as well.
Great, thank you very much, George. And I just want to say, I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I want to thank my great set of panelists, and thank you to all who have been watching and also putting some great questions in the chat. It's been really good to see the momentum behind the debate, and indeed Rebecca highlighted how much has changed and moved on over the last couple of years. I hope, Ron, that helps a little bit with your cynicism after 20 years. So really now it's important that we keep up this momentum on this vital area, and that we do actually drive forward with it. Really good that we can hold this sort of session thanks to COVID, I suppose, that we now know how to hold this sort of session despite the cancellation. Let's keep working on this agenda. Let's look at that question, that key question of how business and government can work together in the future, and we'll certainly be working on building that bridge from our role in the city. Please do take up the invitation from Rebecca there to feed back to her. So almost exactly on time. Can I just thank everybody for all their participation and support, and thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your great moderating.
Thank you.